I've tried to back away from these weather videos, but given what happened the last 2 days, which is actually concerning at this point, and how the warmth is likely to continue on into Friday, I thought I had to address this. Pretty much for the whole time before today, before what happened this afternoon, I was thinking, it's warm in mid-April, but that usually happens in New York City. This is just a time in which the wind off the water isn't working. And I thought I was right on this. You know, the Farmingdale area where I live hasn't hit the 80s since April 29th, 2017, before yesterday. But Central Park had hit the 80s so many times in April. I mean, this happened on April 13th, 2018. It happened on sometime in April 2019. It happened on April 28th, 2021. Central Park hit the 80s so many times in April that I assumed, well, this is just normal. On average, Central Park does hit 83 degrees during the month of April, so it's not an unreasonable assumption to assume that at first everything is fine. And that was what I wanted to think for a while. And, you know, it kind of held out. Now, on Tuesday, Islip's 71-degree high was enough to break a record. But it wasn't concerning at all. I mean, on April 14th, Islip was able to hit a high of 73, and that tied a record. And 70s in April are totally normal. It just happened to be that the record high beforehand was in the 60s. And that was only enough to, I don't even know if it was enough to become the warmest day of the year at that point. No, it wasn't, because April 6th hit 78 degrees at Islip, which again, not too concerning at first, considering there was a massive storm pushing up against us. Typically, the temperatures tend to swell up before that storm, and it was an intense storm that just wound up missing us, but pushing all the warm air actually that happened on April 14th, 2022 as well. You know, at first I wanted to just think that everything was totally normal. Yesterday was a day that was supposed to only make its way up to the upper 70s, or perhaps touch 80 degrees. That's not exactly what happened, though. Where I live, in the Farmingdale area as a whole, wound up hitting 84 degrees yesterday, which I thought wasn't bad, but it wasn't good either. Islip had a chance to have its second warmest April night on record, with a low of 61, but the low wound up plummeting to 55, which is still a record. I don't know if anyone else had a record warm low, but no one had a record warm high, despite high temperatures really swelling itself up. I mean, 83 at Islip and at LaGuardia, 84 at Bridgeport, Kennedy, and Central Park, and 87 at Newark. But because of how warm and how consistently warm it was on April 12th back in 1977, that was not yet good enough to set any kind of record for high temperatures. It wasn't, and that was kind of unfortunate, because I mean, I knew that it probably wasn't happening in Central Park, but for it to happen in a place such as Islip kind of stood out to me as to how the hell Islip would get itself into the 80s multiple times on the same date, considering how rare it is to be in the 80s in April when you have wind off the water, and how it happened multiple times on the same date. Now, remember what I told you about the temperature in Islip crashing? Well, today the low temperature did make its way up into the upper 50s. That simply did not matter, though. The thermometer was something else today. I don't know what the low temperatures are going to be yet, and there's the potential for them to drop really down to midnight, so we'll get more information on this in the morning. But looking at high temperatures, they were all broke a record except the Kennedy, and the 85-degree high at Kennedy was still enough to tie a record. 79 degrees at Bridgeport, cool down from yesterday. Only place to have a cool down from yesterday. Central Park wound up hitting 90 degrees. That was not only a record, it was their 4th earliest 90-degree day on record and their hottest April day since 2010, which wound up being the hottest April on record. In addition to that, Newark soared up to 92 degrees. LaGuardia was 89. Islip was 84 again. No, not again, but Islip was 84. I think I hit on all of them. Again, a little bit weird how Bridgeport 79 was all of a sudden enough for a record, but the 83 that they were, or 84 that they were yesterday wasn't. But the warmth was no longer as consistent on previous days. I mean, this was something else. So, why exactly is it so bad? First of all, this isn't constrained to just the New York metro area. They were talking about how there were record high 80s in Minnesota as well, and it's been a boiling heat dome across everywhere. It's just that this is the area I'm focusing the most on. Record highs were broken in both Georgetown, Delaware, and at Reading, Pennsylvania yesterday. Both locations broke records yesterday, and today there were a lot of records broken in that area of Pennsylvania. In addition to that, not only were there those but further up in Massachusetts, I mean, I think Hartford wound up hitting 90 degrees somehow. I don't know how Hartford managed to make its way up to 90 degrees, but again, one of their earlier days on record. It's actually been consistent 90s in a lot of places. So aside from that, consistent 90s, the big question is, why am I all of a sudden concerned about all this? So the reason why this is concerning is mainly because this has been a build-up problem, and we've seen it. We've essentially seen how, I mean, there was one really bad flash freeze in the Northeast, but besides that, our winter here was a total failure. Now, of course, in Minneapolis, where they also hit the 80s, they had their 3rd snowiest on record. Their 3rd snowiest winter on record occurred this year. And the snowpack was also why there were days where it was literally, even early on, where it was 80s in parts of South Dakota, and with the snowpack, 40s. Why was there such a big difference? Because of the snowpack, which has been rapidly melting and is allowing them to make their way into the 80s. They're soaring on up. But the thing is that here in the New York metro area, we open up the year very warm, and while the lows in parts of the island start off the year in the upper 30s, there were 49 the first days at Central Park, breaking a record on January 2nd. January 4th tied a record high at 66 in the park, while also breaking records at Islip and one of the site, Islip hitting 65. So no one off the water already in the 60s. Now, thankfully, that was the only really warm day in January. And we were hoping that in February, after a snowless January, maybe something could actually change. And it didn't, considering the fact as to how February 10th saw at least one record be broken or tied for either warm or low. And by the 16th, we're seeing lows in the mid-50s in February and highs flirting on 70. And of course, the amount of snow we got, Central Park's 2.3 inches and Bridgeport's 4.9 make it the least snowy winter on record. Now, Islip is at number 5, and everywhere else is at number 2, possibly tied with at number 2. But Central Park and Bridgeport had their least snowy winter on record. it was a total failure. Colossal failure on many levels as to how embarrassing this was. And what was supposed to be a cold March wound up fading out, because even though it couldn't get past 63, it also couldn't get lower than anywhere between 24 at Islip, and some places couldn't get below 30 at all. Central Park could only reach a min of 29 degrees. So it's been a concerning winter. Warmest first quarter on record. And I think that what made it even worse was now this concerning warmth. So now what I'm going to do is put a lot of these numbers into just a little bit of perspective as to how egregiously warm it truly got. So, first of all, this was the warmest day since September, and in some places it was the warmest day since early September. Like Central Park had their warmest day since September 4th, when it also hit 90 degrees. 90s in September are not common, but they are more common than 90s in April. In addition to that, obviously, this 90s is the warmest April day since 2010. On average, it's not supposed to hit the 90s until sometime in late May. This is the fourth earliest date for a 90-degree temperature. Newark, it was their third warmest. Newark did hit 88 degrees on April 14th last year, so that's what made me a little bit more surprised to hear about this statistic. So, when you look at it along, besides that, there's a few other comparisons, mainly against last year. So, first of all, high of 80 degrees or warmer. Last year it didn't happen until May 21st, which was one of the latest dates for that occurrence, latest since 1988, as a matter of fact. Although this was made up for the fact that every single day in July had a high in the 80s. So, bye-bye opportunity. And this year it happened on April 6th, which a little bit earlier than normal, but 80s in March, it's not really that concerning. But then what happened was that after a bit of a cool down, yesterday hit 84. Today hit 90, which we talked about how concerning that 90-degree reading was. And this is for Central Park. Tomorrow is also forecast to be in the 80s. That would string together 3 days with highs in the 80s. Last year, it didn't happen until June 13th to 15th. And on average, this happens May 21st through 23rd. Not saying May 21st to 23rd on average on the 80s, but on average, when you have 3 consecutive of those days, they will, on average, make it into the 80s. Last year, it came close to being exactly average, but it failed at doing so because May 23rd did not hit the 80s after it was 90 on May 21st and 89 on May 22nd. And I don't think Friday's going to do that either. I don't think it's going to really outperform as badly as yesterday when it was supposed to be in the upper 70s and we hit the mid 80s, or today where it was supposed to only be in the mid 80s and it wound up varying heavily. I mean, like, from what I recall on my walk, Jericho hit 87, but parts further north were only able to make their way up to 85. Still though, that definitely isn't anything comforting. And And while I don't think tomorrow's going to outperform as badly thanks to clouds, I am confident that it will hit the 80s. Well, you know, regardless. I think that it will hit the 80s. And now and again, string together very early consecutive days in the 80s. I don't know if we've really seen them be that early. No, we have March 1998 saw 5 consecutive. All right, now. So besides from me complaining about how anomalous this is, what's in store after Friday? Well, thankfully, a massive cool down. But massive. After Friday peaks out in the 80s, we're not going to be hitting the 70s for a while. And 70s have been hard to come by with, of course, most of the days that we had to enjoy in the 70s also then flirting with the 80s. So, again, this spring is going to be like this very awkward battle, and we're going to really miss out on the nicest days. By the way, that 7:10 p.m. temperature of 78 degrees, just I want to show that to you is another piece of concerning evidence as to how, it should not be in the upper 70s when the sun is setting. Yes, temps are going to fall back to the upper 50s, but then they're going to go back to the low 80s, and it's just turned out to be an exceptionally ugly early season, almost heat wave that everyone thought was just going to be a nice weather over April break. And now we're actually starting to see it turn ugly.